The Trump administration freezes all new firearm exports. Plus, a federal judge blocks Maine's waiting period law for gun sales. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. Kick us off this week, a little bit of broken news. You broke a little bit of a story about kind of a confusing situation, but a potentially far-reaching situation dealing with export licenses. Evidently, there is a blanket export pause on new licenses, and that's necessarily impacting the gun industry.
Yeah. There hasn't been a lot of reporting on this thus far. So we're one of the first outlets to cover it. Certainly the first to cover it in light of the gun industry itself, which is going to be deeply affected by this because starting on February 5th, apparently, there was a freeze put on all new export licenses from the Commerce Department's Bureau of what does the I stand for? Industry and Security, right? Anyway, it's the bureau that issues export licenses for most products. The State Department handles some weapons exports mainly for like military purposes around the world under what's called ITAR. And then BIS does a lot of the other export licensing, which does cover commercial gun sales, civilian gun sales from the U.S. to other countries. You guys might remember BIS because we broke a story last year during the end of the Biden administration about a previous pause on export licensing that the Biden administration had put in place with the goal of reworking export licensing restrictions on certain kinds of guns being sold into certain countries, right? And so the Biden administration put a 90-day pause. It ended up being longer than 90 days in reality, but it was around 90 days in order to finalize these new regulations and put those in place. And so during that time, anyone who exported basically what most people would call in our gun debate gets labeled assault weapons, right? AR-15s, AK-47s, basically semi-automatic centerfire rifles with detachable magazines and other features. That was essentially what they were targeting with that pause in the Biden administration, and it was only to certain countries. There's a export agreement, like an arms export agreement that a lot of countries have signed on to called the Wassenaar Pact, I think it's called. But either way, it's there's different country codes in there, and certain countries get higher scrutiny, but those countries often they include some very well-known nations like Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, for instance, some sort of global hotspots, places where people might really want to import firearms as well at this point. But either way, that pause ended and the new regulations came in. And now, only a few months later, after that whole ordeal, the Trump administration has decided to put a blanket pause on all new export licenses, not just for firearms, to be fair. Like, this seems to apply to so many other things as well, but it does apply to essentially all gun exports, unlike the Biden. So it's a bit broader, and to all countries. Now, there's a lot of confusion around this right now because BIS is not communicating with anyone publicly. They haven't put out any sort of statement or policy sheet on this, why it's happening, how long it's going to be in effect, whether it's been pulled back at all. We had some of our sources. We talked to Larry Keane from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade group, about how this is impacting the gun industry. And then we also talked to Joanne Reeves, who is a export lawyer who's worked with a number of firearms companies over the decades on exports and is well-versed in what's going on in the space. And, there were conflicting views from them about whether the blanket ban is still applied to all countries today, 2 weeks or more into this freeze, or if it's been lifted on some countries. So there's not a lot of clarity that we have on the exact details of what's going on, but it does appear to be a wide-reaching freeze at the moment that is going to be especially hard on gun exporters compared to other industries, because, as I mentioned earlier, this is the second freeze within a year that they're having to deal with. So, they're right back to this sort of uncertainty and upheaval that they were experiencing under the Biden freeze, but actually to a greater extent now, because this applies more broadly than that one.
Right. And you quoted Larry Keane from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, who, of course, that organization represents the firearms industry as its trade association, talking about how quickly the backlog is growing from companies that are trying to export their products abroad. Obviously, it's part of their business and they're getting no clarity. And he said he's hearing reports of 400 backlogged license approvals per day, up to 2,000 per week. So that's obviously a big hit to the bottom line of a lot of these companies. And like you said, it's sort of just a total whiplash moment for a lot of industries, but the gun industry in particular, because it was a months long freeze while the Biden administration's rules went into effect. Then they went into effect and the licenses were restricted, but you could at least get them. And then you had Trump's, I think a couple episodes ago, we talked about Howard Lutnick, who Trump tapped to be the new Commerce Secretary, talking about one of the things he was going to do is revoke that Commerce Department restriction on export licenses.
Right.
And he gets into office, but now there's just a blanket freeze that affects the industry. So it's just a back and forth whiplash effect.
Definitely something hard to navigate for these companies, I would imagine. We'll have to follow up and talk to some of these exporters and see how they're handling this. Because last time we talked to them, the guys who were affected by the first freeze, the Biden pause, first of all, it's much narrower under Biden, because it only impacted those kinds of weapons, AR-15s and similar semi-automatic rifles and so forth. And a lot of countries restrict ownership of those kinds of guns for civilians anyway. So it's not a huge part of the market necessarily. This one goes after basically everything, all guns, and lots of other exports too. Which is obviously a bit odd given, the Trump administration's stated goals of trying to reduce the trade deficit. Shutting off all exports is not likely to help with that end goal. But there's also not really any communication as to why this is happening or when it's going to end. There's some speculation, right? NSSF told us, Larry said that essentially they believe it's because we're still waiting to get the Undersecretary of Commerce for this bureau confirmed, the Trump pick for that. And so they just put a freeze on everything in the meantime. And so once he's confirmed, maybe the freeze will be lifted. It's not clear, though, because no one is saying anything publicly. So people are working off word of mouth. And, what BIS employees told one company then gets filtered to others in the industry. And that's essentially the atmosphere that these exporters are working under right now, which is not an ideal atmosphere for planning a business, obviously. And excuse me. So I think I'm getting a little sick, by the way. I don't know. It's just in my throat, but I don't seem to get any other symptoms, but there's something going on. So apologies for that. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, there's just a total uncertainty. There's no written policy on why this has happened, what the plan is. Like the Biden pause, they at least justified that as a review while they implement new rules for exports of certain firearms to certain countries. This is just, we're stopping all exporting licenses for all gun exports to all countries for some indeterminate amount of time for some reason. If you can go through the story and see, some of the reactions to that throughout the export industry. People are not happy with those answers they're getting, or non-answers, I guess, that they're getting. I did find there was an executive order that deals with trade that directs the Commerce Secretary to undergo like a review of export policies with the intention of basically finding and shutting loopholes that allow foreign adversaries to export products that that the Trump administration doesn't want them to have. But those seem to be more in the like computer and software space, if that makes, there's more national security implications rather than civilian gun exports. And also the order doesn't tell them to shut down export licensing anywhere in there. In fact, it just tells them to send a report back, similar to the gun executive order. They're just supposed to write up a report and come up with solutions and send those back and really it's not supposed to the report's not even supposed to be submitted until April. So I don't know whether the confirmation of this undersecretary is going to undo the freeze, or public pressure is going to make them reverse course here, or if they're going to have to wait for this report to get submitted in April, which would be, several months from now. I don't know. It's not clear, but the impacts are going to be felt most, I think, in the gun industry, even though this appears to apply well beyond the gun industry to other industries that are going to be higher level export, like higher volume exporters. It's just another round of uncertainty and delay for gun exporters. And so they're probably going to be hurt the most by this, I would imagine. Now that exporting is not totally shut down, because licenses that were submitted for approval before February 5th are still being processed, right? So it's not necessarily something where there's an immediate shutdown of exporting in the United States. This is something that is going to be felt on a delay, because a lot of these export licenses are issued and good for, a year or more, right? So you can still export under your previously approved license. They're just not giving out any new licenses. And so it is possible that at the end of the day, they're able to clear that backlog before you run into significant problems with actual physical exports at at our ports. Though it seems like that would be very difficult, and you'd have to surge resources to the agency. And honestly, if you look around the federal government right now, the more likely outcome is they're going to start firing people from this, from BIS and Commerce. And so we'll have to see what this develops into. But, and then at the same time, there are at least rumors that they are going to follow through with what Lutnick said at his confirmation hearing and try to undo Biden era regulations on exporting certain kinds of firearms to certain countries, right? The AR-15 style guns to Ukraine or Israel or what have you. So this is another scenario where I think the industry and the gun rights movement is not happy with what's happening at the moment, but they're hopeful that in the end they'll get the things that they want, which, maybe that will happen. It is a strong possibility. I mean, after all, even if Trump doesn't have guns as a top priority, and I think that's more what this shows. Like, they're not, unlike the Biden move, where that was intended to target the gun exporting industry. This seems more like they're kind of collateral damage in all this. And the bigger takeaway, in my view at least, is again that they're deprioritizing the interest of the gun rights movement or the gun industry in how they're going about tackling some of their other priorities. in this case, trade policy, right? It's not necessarily that they're trying to hurt the gun exporters. It's just that they value bringing down the trade deficit or preventing certain countries from getting products they don't want them to have. They value that more than the business interests of gun exporters. And so even still, at the end of that, you could have pro-gun reforms come into play eventually. If these gun exporters survive this sort of thing, they may end up at the end with a situation that they prefer to, what they had in 2024, for instance. But right now, today, it's all negative impacts at this point. And it sort of it maybe speaks to why they haven't. This started happening on February 5th. We didn't hear about it until this week and late into this week because the industry was not making a lot of noise about it. It sounds like, the NSSF had been in contact with BIS, so perhaps they were trying to find a backdoor solution here using soft power, right? Instead of going public and complaining about it until the administration maybe does something. And, I think explains a lot of what you see with gun rights advocacy at the moment is like, there's still a lot of hope that they're going to be able to, accomplish things through the Trump administration. And the recent gun executive order is an example of that, where there's a lot of excitement around the potential for that. And we're going to be talking more about the order and some of its implications again on the show this week, but with somebody from a little bit of a different perspective. Andrew Wellinger from Duke's Firearms Law Center will be on the show. So we'll dig more into that and some of the possibilities there. But there's a lot of excitement around in gun rights organizations for what this could lead to. It obviously doesn't do anything yet, but it has a lot of potential. And that's why you don't necessarily see them going out of their way to jump on Trump for over everything they might jump on a Democrat for. Like I don't know, the whole thing where he called himself a king this week. And the White House posted a picture of him in a crown. Obviously the context there, I suppose, is it was him shutting down the congestion taxing for Manhattan. So obviously seems more on the troll joke side of the spectrum, I guess. Although I don't know how. It'd be very surprising to me if any Democrat ever made a joke like that as president, and every gun rights group in the country didn't immediately freak out about it. But you didn't see that with Trump, obviously, and I think that's just the reality of trying to work within the administration and get things from them instead of using, hard public power, like criticism to go after. Not that there's been no criticism of Trump from the gun rights groups, but this is how politics tends to work, and why things, I think, turn out this way often. Yeah.
We'll have to see what happens. Obviously, we'll keep everyone up to date as this rolls out. And once again, it's another indication or another instance of, Commerce and BIS didn't respond to comment. They're not really saying anything publicly, so we don't know where this is going to go.
Which is very reassuring to these exporters, I'm sure.
I'm sure, yeah. But when we know more, we'll make sure to keep you guys informed. But you can check out both the news reporting as well as your members piece that you wrote about this on the Reload website. So another big story this week in the legal setting comes from a federal judge in Maine. Just put a preliminary injunction on that state's 72-hour or 3-day waiting period for gun sales. This was perhaps the biggest policy that passed in Maine. Sort of in the wake of the Lewiston shooting, there was a big push for gun control, and Maine has sort of fascinating political dynamics in that it's a Democratic leaning state, but it's also a very pro-gun state, at least historically pro-gun state with a lot of sportsmen. And so this was one of the few gun control policies that were able to get through. And now it has been blocked by a federal judge. So interesting.
Yeah. And, these two rulings that we're going to talk about, they're on like sort of laws that get a lot of support, especially in blue states, but haven't seen a ton of litigation. especially successful litigation. And so, it's very interesting to see the waiting periods get blocked in this way, as not comporting with the historical tradition of firearms regulation. Of course, there really wasn't a lot of commercial firearms regulation at the founding at all. So, it's always kind of fascinating when we get into these cases, because the Supreme Court in Heller obviously said they weren't calling into question longstanding commercial regulations of firearms with the ruling in Heller. But the Bruin standard sets up a big fight over these, really all commercial gun regulations. And I don't think that means they're going to strike down, especially the Supreme Court, all commercial gun regulations. I just don't, that's very unlikely to happen. With the makeup of the court and some of the ways that they've argued in oral arguments and the things that have been written either in majority opinions in Bruin and Rahimi, or other cases like the bump stock ban case, for instance, or in concurrences. So, it's going to be interesting to see how the federal court system over the coming years really works out which commercial regulations are okay and which aren't under the Bruin standard. But here's an example of one where a judge said waiting periods are not within that historical tradition. There's no how and why match to a founding regulation. And so he struck down the restriction, right?
And to your point, this is one of the first time, there are very few of these cases, at least compared to some like the felon in possession challenges or assault weapon ban challenges that have sort of dominated a lot of the conversation post Bruin. But the few that have almost unanimously upheld waiting periods to date. And that's because, sort of to your point, even though historically, if you look at the founding era, there weren't a ton of commercial restrictions, a lot of federal judges have glommed on to the Heller language about, well, we're not calling into question commercial restrictions. And so they'll use that dicta, or they'll say, sure, the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear, but it doesn't say anything about the right to purchase or acquire, and therefore the plain text isn't implicated, and so we don't have to do any historical analysis. And so we've seen that almost that
one. You have a right to keep and bear arms, but not to acquire them.
Right.
This is the one weird trick solution. I think I wrote about this a while back. Oh well, you have a right to own and carry guns, but not to buy them.
Right. Oh, as long as they come down like manna from heaven, and then they're protected.
If they just appear out of thin air, then you can then they're protected. But otherwise, So I don't know. It is interesting that this doesn't get as much litigation. Even as some other restrictions, assault weapons bans, magazine restrictions, carry restrictions. Those have been a lot more widely litigated than waiting periods have to this point. And so, and it's interesting to see a judge go this direction, because like you said, most of them have upheld these in the past with maybe a bit a bit on the flimsier end of the logic train there. But we have another one that's challenged in Arizona, right? Another very well-known restriction, but one that hasn't seen a lot of court action, really.
I would say this is one that's become increasingly common in blue states, and even in some purple states, is when Democrats get temporary control in purple states. This tends to be one of their lower hanging fruit gun control policies that they pass, which is a mandatory reporting. If you lose or have a firearm stolen, you must report to the police within usually 48 hours, sometimes 72 hours. It varies by the law. In this case, this was a local Arizona ordinance that required 48-hour reporting. And a judge in this case said that that's not going to fly. So that's interesting. Yeah,
this was in Pima County, Arizona, and this was a state judge. And, to be fair, it's not as interesting of a case on the sort of legal end as the previous one, because this is a preemption case. So this is a case where the plaintiffs argued that Arizona has a law that says localities can't create their own gun regulations, essentially. And this is a gun regulation, so it should be thrown out. And the judge essentially agreed with that. The county had argued that it's not a gun regulation that would be covered under the preemption law, but obviously the judge disagreed on that point, and so that's why it didn't. It isn't moving forward. It's not going to be enforced. So this was, these are interesting laws, right? I mean, obviously, most people I think would agree you have a responsibility as a gun owner to report your lost or stolen firearm to law enforcement in case, especially because if it shows up in a crime later on, you probably want to have a record that it was stolen, or somebody that it's not yours anymore. It wasn't in your possession. So it's also just a smart thing to do, I think, generally speaking. But these laws put the onus on the owner to do that, or else they'll face a criminal penalty. Now it's a petty crime, so you're not going to face jail time, but it was up to $1,000 fine for every offense of not reporting, and not just not reporting them lost or stolen, but not doing it within 48 hours of not just when you knew, but when you ought to have known. So it's pretty nebulous standard there. A lot of flexibility for law enforcement, not so much for the person who had their gun stolen. Which that was one of the arguments from the named plaintiff in the case, basically saying this. You're going after the wrong people here, not the people who stole the gun, but the people who were stolen from. Now, obviously, the county, and oftentimes this is the argument the other direction. They will say that this is a way of combating straw purchases, because I guess what can happen with a straw purchase is somebody goes in and buys a gun for somebody else who can't legally own it, right? They knowingly do that. That's a straw purchase, right? If you as somebody who can pass a background check goes and buys a gun for somebody who can't in order to give that gun to that person, that's a straw purchase. It's actually even broader than that, but we don't need to get into even further details. But and so the problem is for law enforcement is that if then the criminal who got the gun through this straw purchase uses it in a crime and it's recovered there, then they trace it back to the straw purchaser. The straw purchaser is likely to say, oh, I lost that gun or it was stolen. But they didn't report it until the police showed up at their door. And so the argument is, these lost and stolen gun reporting requirements will combat that criminal sort of enterprise of buying guns for criminals, and then if they get traced back to you after being found in a crime, you just claim that it was lost. You lost it or it was stolen at some point, and you never reported it. So that's the argument for why these laws should exist. But that really didn't get litigated in court, because this case wasn't about the merits of the law. It was about the fact that Pima County can't enact its own gun restrictions. So, like, if Arizona wanted to implement a lost and stolen reporting requirement, they could. Perhaps, you'd have to go with a different kind of challenge then, as some sort of Second Amendment challenge, perhaps. But Pima County can't just do it on their own. And this is something we've seen all over the country, something we followed a lot, these preemption fights. Philadelphia, in fact, there was another link this week, right? That Gun Owners of America's case against Philadelphia for enacting its own ghost gun regulations despite Pennsylvania's preemption law that has now reached the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, right? Even though it was a lower court had agreed with Philadelphia on the same basic logic that they're claiming this is not regulation of guns because unfinished firearms pieces they're not firearms. So that was another story we linked to, right?
Yeah, So officially, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court agreed to take up that case. We reported at the time the appeals court ruling where they made that decision that yes, they have preemption law and they can't do firearms regulation, but an unfinished frame is not a firearm. Therefore, this doesn't fall under preemption, and Philadelphia is good to go. And Philadelphia really is sort of ground zero. Not that they're the only place
loves doing this,
where preemption fights happen. They happen everywhere that there's a preemption law, but Philadelphia really has been the envelope pusher when it comes to repeatedly passing local gun control ordinances and almost always having them lose, in court.
This is one of the first times they succeeded.
Right. And that's why I linked to it, because I think this is an interesting test case to see if they can finally fulfill their quest to find the one weird trick loophole out of the preemption statute. So,
yeah. Because they just lost the Pennsylvania Supreme Court over a similar preemption fight, although a much more nebulous argument about like the city's rights to.
Yeah, they said that the preemption law was a violation of Philadelphia's constitutional rights. And,
right, which is not a thing.
The Supreme Court was not having that.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania Supreme Court, my understanding is leans Democrat. I think it's directly elected and partisan, which is a choice, I guess, if you're going to judge elections, that partisan ones. But regardless, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the nonpartisan ones kind of turn into partisan elections anyway. But so, the lean there is definitely towards the Democrats in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and they still rejected this argument. So we'll see what they do with this case. Yeah,
absolutely. Getting into some of our other links, we have an interesting one from Politico, sort of the continuing fallout of the Trump pardons of the January 6th defendants. In this case, a interesting interpretation by the DOJ as to how far those pardons extend into what conduct they apply to. And in the particular story we linked to, it deals with firearms law, or at least a firearms law violation that is not going to be prosecuted anymore.
Yeah, kind of it's hard to describe it as anything other than an expansion of the pardon of the January 6th offenders, because the pardon itself says that only, crimes associated with what happened on January 6th in and around the Capitol are supposed to be part of this pardon. But these cases that DOJ are dropping now relate to gun charges that came later. Now, they came as part of the investigation into the January 6th crimes, and I know at least in one case here, and there have been several of these, but at least in one case, that this was somebody who was already a convicted felon before the January 6th charges. So he would have been prohibited from owning firearms. And during the investigation into the riot, as part of that, there were searches where they found this felon was in possession of firearms, and so that they were charged for that as well. And now DOJ apparently is taking the view that, that the January 6th offenders can't commit crimes. I guess they're tangentially connecting because the search was related to the January 6th prosecutions. It's hard to read the language of the pardon and square it with this and not see it as just an expansion of that pardon for these offenders. But that's what's going on.
Yeah. Interesting interpretation by the DOJ. Another link we want to briefly mention is the New York Times had a big feature this week talking about sort of the changing face of gun ownership in the year 2025. They did a story about the changing face of gun ownership, and I'm sure our listeners are surprised. But it was actually a pretty interesting feature. They profile 5 separate gun owners who, over the last couple of years, most of them came from very progressive backgrounds, underrepresented minority backgrounds as well, talking about why they decided to, how they made the decision to purchase a gun. Many of them said that they previously would have considered themselves anti-gun, and they just allowed them to tell their stories about how they became gun owners. And I'm sure, to our listeners, it's a familiar tale.
You might recognize this story. Not that they're not like ripping us off or anything, but it's just like and we were not the only ones to talk about this phenomenon and report on it at the time, but they're kind of, 4 or 5 years too late to this one. I mean, it's good. It was a good story. It's good reporting, but it's just, they're a bit slow, I guess, to getting to this, because this was like one of the main things we covered when I launched the Reload back in 2021. We're actually coming up here on our 4th anniversary right in April. So, that's wild, but yeah, that was one of the big thrusts. And that was something I was reporting on even before when I was at the Washington Free Beacon. This trend, and honestly, it's not even pandemic related trend. This has been going on. We've had David Yamani, professor, who studies this phenomenon, but this has been going on for decades now, where there's been a shift in the face of gun owners in America, from more towards people who have been traditionally represented among gun, like traditionally haven't owned guns at the same rate as, other Americans, and they're buying guns more. And the pandemic certainly sped that up. And there are a lot of interesting stories from that time that we ourselves have covered. And honestly, I think it's good that the New York Times is doing this, and they seem to be presenting it in a pretty fair way, just letting these people explain themselves. I mean, that's reporting, right? And so good for them. It's a little late to the story, but at least they're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last thing, before we wrap up here, I think you wanted to touch on a little bit of editorial decisions related to sort of the ongoing discussion around USAID and funding and various claims flying around on social media, and maybe where we draw the line in terms of when we jump on a story.
I saw a comment on this, and actually still have to respond, so apologies to that member, but saw a comment on this regard about USAID and its supposed funding of, gun control groups like Everytown and Giffords. And, people, I've seen a lot of this going around online, especially, a week or two ago when Elon Musk was talking about it as justification for, part of justification for, I guess, trying to wholesale shut down USAID, which there's still an ongoing fight about in the courts, of course. But, and honestly, I haven't seen a lot of strong evidence that there was any sort of, there's no evidence that there was any sort of direct grant given from USAID to Everytown or Giffords. It's more of a series of grants that people sort of almost a 6 degrees of separation thing, Kevin Bacon situation with these, what people are drawing conclusions from, where it's like USAID gave a grant to this NGO, non-government organization, nonprofit. That one gave it to another group, then gave a grant to another group, then gave a grant to another group, then gave another group, and then that group gave to Everytown. And I just think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the nonprofit system works. On the one hand, I think it's good for people to understand how these organizations all interact with each other. But I don't think the full picture is really being presented in social media or some of the pieces that I've seen on this, because, guess what happens if you go to there's a website that some sort of that somebody set up to try and, show every group that's gotten grants from USAID and every group that they've given grants to, and so on down the line for 5 or 6 or 7 steps. And if you look in that website, or if you go to, obviously not the first government spending website to exist out there, there's a lot of them. A lot of this stuff it's always been public. It's not really new information. But what you'll find is that, I think really any group that's of a significant size is going to show up in that graph somewhere. So, I mean, you could probably guess, but the NRA shows up in the same way if you search for them as Everytown and Giffords do. And all it really tells you essentially is that USAID gave a grant to somebody for some purpose. They don't, these websites don't, I think, and a lot of stories don't explain that context of why the first grant was given. Because generally what happens is a group will give a grant to another group, either perhaps starting at a government agency like USAID, and they'll give it for a very specific purpose, and money will have to be used for that purpose. And it's given to a specific part of that organization. So for instance, at the end of these lines, when you see the NRA or Everytown or Giffords show up, what you're seeing their 501c3 arm most of the time in these sorts of donations, like basically the NRA Foundation, for instance, which is the part of the NRA as a legal entity that does, non-political stuff, firearms safety training, youth shooting, sports events, things of that nature. Then they have to only spend money on those purposes. And generally they're getting grants. They're the ones who are going to get grants from big corporate charity organizations, for instance, and not necessarily the NRA's political arms, their PAC or their 501c4. Most of these organizations, like the NRA in Everytown and Giffords, when you get to a certain size, the system of political giving is designed for them to have to operate in a certain way. And so they tend to be made up of a bunch of different groups, legally speaking. Like the NRA is not one group. It's like 8 different legal entities that work together, but they're not, they're limited in how they can raise money and how they can spend that money, right? The 501c3, the foundation, can raise money from a lot of different sources, and the money given to them is tax deductible, right? But public, and it's can only be used on certain expenses that are non-political in nature. And there are ways to move money between these different organizations, but there's a lot of rules about that as well. Like the foundation, for instance, one of the things the NRA does, and that a lot of these groups do, is they'll have their foundation work out of the offices that are owned by a different legal entity inside of the organization, right? So the foundation will pay rent to the 501c4 or the PAC or what have you. Like, there are rules about how you can move this money around. It can be done, and sometimes that's where organizations get in trouble too. In fact, the NRA actually did get in trouble. They had to settle and come to a consent decree with the Attorney General of DC over how they were moving money between their foundation and their other legal entities. But bottom line here to me is, like, I haven't seen anything that suggests USAID was intentionally giving money to Everytown or NRA or any of the other groups in question here. And what's happening is the USAID gives a grant to some NGO for some purpose, and then the NGO likely does multiple things, right? And so then they might give a grant to another organization that also does multiple things. So that the first grant, it's not necessarily true that money just flows right through these organizations to the endpoint. Because then you could also, this is sort of an endless thing, because you could then point to where Everytown and the NRA are giving grants themselves, and it would just continue on forever, I guess, in that sense, if that's how you're looking at this. So, it's valuable to understand how these groups are funded and how the funding works. But I think if you're drawing too many conclusions from that, you're not going to get to the truth, essentially. Like, I haven't seen any evidence that there's actually an effort from USAID to give money to Everytown. Like, because a lot of the stuff is just, there's 5 groups between the two, and there's nobody providing any evidence that there's some intention to move the money from USAID through those groups to Everytown. Just that the grants went out in each direction. So, and certainly I haven't seen any sort of, even if that happened, right, there may be, perhaps someone will find evidence. I'd be interested to see any evidence of USAID giving directly to any of these gun groups, NRA or Everytown or Giffords or whoever else, Brady, whatever. But even if that happened, if they're giving to Brady, for instance, does those ads that you'll see on TV about safe storage, and those are non-political ads. They're classified under federal law as a non-partisan, non-political ad. They can spend money on that sort of thing, and it wouldn't necessarily be illegal for. USAID probably wouldn't do it because that's not the purpose of what they were set up there for foreign aid, but other government entities may give money in that way. And it may be something that you don't like, and a new administration could come in and say, we're not going to do this anymore, but it's also not necessarily illegal. Right? That wouldn't be evidence of illegality. It would just be giving funds to a group you don't like. And that's a policy choice, and certainly one that can be reversed, but it's different from an actual scandal of some type. And I'm always happy to report on evidence of real scandals here, but I just haven't seen anything in all this that amounts to. Honestly, a lot of it is just that Charlie meme from It's Always Sunny, where people are just drawing lines between groups without any. If you look at it, a lot of times the money, the amounts that go between the groups are not similar. Right? It'll be a big grant to one group from USAID, and then a much smaller grant from another group, and then a bigger grant to the next group, and then a smaller. There's like no throughput other than that. These groups got grants from each other or gave grants to another group. There's no evidence that there's some nefarious purpose for why the money went 5 organizations through to an endpoint that you don't, that is a group you don't agree with. So I don't know. It just didn't rise to the level of having any evidence that there's wrongdoing occurring from what I've seen. So if there is evidence, if people can find evidence of like, some sort of nefarious aspect to any of this, I'm happy to look at it, but it just didn't. That's why we didn't cover it. And I like, again, if your takeaway is to look at this stuff and say, oh, I didn't realize, the funding network involved here, or how interconnected a lot of these groups can be, or whatever, or how, honestly, it just doesn't strike me as new information or anything terribly scandalous. I mean, yes, like groups give money to each other, unless they're violating some sort of law, I just don't, and I certainly don't see evidence of the conclusions a lot of people have jumped to, which is that there's nefarious money laundering going on. Like this is all in public. It's all public record. Like this, none of this was hidden before. Just because some people started paying closer attention to it doesn't mean that it was not in public record to begin with. If there's evidence that there's some of this wasn't, that if you find money going between groups and they aren't reporting it properly, that's a scandal, right? That's something that is worth writing up. But yeah, I just didn't see much in this USAID stuff. It was just a lot of USAID gave to somebody who 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 gave to every town. And you could do the same thing with almost any large nonprofit group, including the NRA. You wouldn't find many other gun rights groups in there because a lot of them aren't that big and they don't have these complex networks of nonprofits necessarily. So, that's generally speaking why you're not going to see some of the other smaller gun rights groups show up. But you will see plenty of right wing or conservative groups show up, and if you go and look for them.
Right. Yeah. That's just helpful
that they're doing anything wrong either, frankly.
Right. But yeah, no, it's good context because like you said, we got that comment and then there's been discussions on social media and all sorts of things. So it's just helpful.
I've seen a lot of talk about it.
Explain where we come down on which stories we choose to report and which hot button social media topics we leave for the chattering online and not for.
I mean, honestly, the gun rights groups or the gun control groups, most of their funding doesn't come from government grants. It comes from one guy, Michael Bloomberg.
A small handful of billionaires.
Yeah, rich people fund the gun control movement to a large extent, mostly through foundations, and some of those foundations are multi-purpose and they get grants from other foundations, and it can go back, and eventually some money will be from government in some way. But generally it's not, like, people have to understand how this all works. Like, there are rules to how this money can be brought in and spent. And if there's evidence that people are ignoring those rules, that's the scandal. And that's where it matters. Like, if they're just spending funds on things they're not allowed to spend funds on, then yeah, that's a scandal. That's a problem. That's reportable and, a story. If it's just they're following these funding laws and 5 or 6 grants back, there's a government source somewhere. That's probably true of almost every large nonprofit that's operating today. And I don't think it says very much, but
right.
I'm open to further evidence, though.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all we've got for you this week. I'm going to hand it off to myself to tell you a little bit more about the Dispatch. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like
what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch. And so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it, and I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload or to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.